All right, so welcome everyone again on behalf of the Center for Political Education. We're really excited to have this conversation and to jump into talking about the left and elections. So we wanted to set a few intentions because we know lefty people like to talk. So we want to be able to create space and honor people's time at the same time. So I'm going to share some of those with you, and then we'll jump into introducing our panelists. Sounds good? All right, y'all. So you will get an opportunity to share your questions, and I think we're going to have some note cards that are going to go around that we ask that you write down your questions. If you hear something that's interesting or something that you agree with, maybe something that you would contend with, write down your question. Keyword here is question. Okay. We're going to ask that that you respect everyone's time, because we will get an opportunity. I think we'll get an opportunity towards the end to do a little bit of question and answer where you'll be able to share. So respect everyone's time. We'll have our panelists spend about 5 minutes sharing their thoughts on a question that we've prompted, and then we'll take a little bit of a pause. You can write your questions down, then we'll move on to the next panelist. Yeah? All right. Disagreement is welcome, but we do ask that you challenge yourself not to attack any single person, that if you have a contention or something that you would share, that you're thoughtful about challenging the idea, not the person. Yeah? This is an important one because CPE is a 501c3, and we're talking about elections, right? So this is a non-solicitation space, right? So we ask that folks use this space to raise their issues, their thoughts, their concerns, but we're not so much interested in sharing specifically an endorsement for candidates, and or you can share information if there's a particular measure or valid information you want to provide, but just being thoughtful that we are a 501c3, that means we follow rules sometimes. Okay. And CPE at the end will be sending out information, so if you have information about your particular group that you would like to share with folks, you can get contact with CPE. We'll provide the information at the end, and they'll make sure to share it out. Yeah? Sounds good?
If you sign in.
If you sign in.
Even if you've signed in before, if you haven't signed in tonight, you will not get the follow-up.
Oh, oops. There are conditions to our love. Okay, sign in. All right, y'all. So let's jump into it. We do have two folks who are joining us via whatever this is, via video, and they're from the East Coast. So they are joining us, and it's quite late over there. So we're going to be thoughtful again about time. I know, I wouldn't do it, but we're going to be thoughtful about time. So let's jump into it. So we have Kayla Reed, who is on video with us. Hi, Kayla. She's with the Electoral Justice Project. She identifies as she or her. She's a Black queer organizer and strategist from St. Louis, Missouri. And after the killing of Michael Brown in August 2014, Kayla was catapulted into organizing around issues of racial justice, policing, and democracy expansion. She's the co-founder and director of Action St. Louis, a grassroots racial justice organization working to build Black political power in St. Louis. Okay. We're going to go through all the introductions and then we'll give folks time. Right? So then we have Ted Fertik, who is a senior strategist with Working Families Academy. Hi, Ted. Wave if you can hear us. All right. So Ted comes with years of experience in electoral strategy and worker organizing in addition to academic training. He was a New York campaigns coordinator and then Oregon State Director for the Working Families Party. While a graduate student in history at Yale University, he was part of the rank and file leadership of GESO, now Local 33 of Unite Here, the long-running campaign to organize Yale's graduate teachers and researchers. He completed his PhD in history in 2018 with a dissertation on the international economics and politics of nationalism, globalization, and U.S. global ascendancy in the interwar period. Oh, that's a lot of words. At Grassroots Policy Project, his work focuses on political education and ideological development with partner organizations, including the Working Families Party. And he is a writer, he's an author. His work has appeared in The Nation, in These Times, and in New Labor Forum. And we have Emily Lee. Hi, Emily, who recognized me from 14 years ago. Great memory, Emily. Emily comes from San Francisco Rising Action Fund and is the director there. It's a 501c4 organization that builds the political power of working class communities of color. Emily has led citywide electoral campaigns with labor and community partners to elect progressives and movement leaders into office. So welcome. And we have Donna Willmott. Donna's political roots are in the militant anti-imperialist organizations of the 1960s. Her politics have been shaped over many years by movements for self-determination, including the Puerto Rican independence movement, the Black liberation movement, and struggles for indigenous sovereignty, as well as organizing against the carceral system. She continues to struggle against white supremacy and patriarchy and for a decolonized future through her work with Catalyst Project, but she's not representing Catalyst Project tonight. Can we give them a round of applause? All right, y'all, so let's jump into it. We'll start with folks who are on the, what is this thing called? Zoom, okay, we use Zoom. Okay, we'll start with maybe Kayla. So we'll give Kayla an opportunity to share with us her thoughts on this particular question that we're prompting all of our speakers to answer. Give me 1 second. All right, so this is what we're talking about tonight, left strategy and the 2020 elections. So we're asking our speakers to state your position on the left strategy that's needed in order to shift the balance of forces beyond November 2020. Shall I read it again? One more again, okay. So we're asking folks to state your position on the left strategy that's needed to shift power beyond November 2020.
Great. Hi, everyone. I knew I was going to go first. I knew that was going to happen. My name is Kayla Reed. I'm in St. Louis. I'm in the Midwest. And again, I'm the director of Action St. Louis, which is a 501c4 here in St. Louis. We also have a 501c3. And I'm also one of the leads on the Electoral Justice Project, which is the civic engagement 501c4, all things electoral of the movement for Black Lives. And we started this project in 2017 as a direct response to lessons learned in our movement around how we engaged in 2016, and seeing it as a time to have a real political conversation amongst ourselves around what this moment requires as it relates to the rise of white nationalism in the form of this current administration here and what we are seeing abroad with the lift in conservatism and right-wing nationalism. And so we put our heads together and we started convening after the November elections in 2016 to come up with a strategy. And so we went through that process for more than a year, thinking through politically what does it take to not only put a stop to this administration, and we know for a lot of reasons why they must be stopped, but to also build real power on the left and to shift people into our movement so that we can have the kind of mass movement that's necessary to actually bring about transformative change. And so the Movement for Black Lives kind of put together a plan. It's called the Project 2024, Black Power Rising. And we look at 5 pillars to think through how to actualize or realize that strategy. The first of those is mass engagement. We know that as the Movement for Black Lives, we need to think about how to talk to people beyond the choir. And often in left spaces, we've kind of fallen to the pigeonhole of seeing the same faces, the same spaces, but we need to engage beyond that. We also think about local power, that all politics is truly local in the ways that we've seen the most historic victories. I mean, you're in the Bay right now. We just saw what happened in San Francisco with the district attorney's race. And that is a part of a larger conversation of shifting people. Yes, like absolutely. That was a part of a larger conversation. We ousted the prosecutor in St. Louis last year who failed to indict the officer that killed Mike Brown. So we led that work here in St. Louis. And so we're thinking about mayors as it relates to police budgets, and DAs as it relates to criminalization, and city councils as it relates to kind of the budget at large, and local policies that ensure protections. When for us, we know that Black people are overwhelmingly concentrated in states under Republican trifectas. There are something like 33 states are 33 states are controlled with both houses of their state legislature and the governor are Republican. And we, put some data to it, and that's about 68% of Black people live in one of those states, hyper in the South, hyper in the Midwest. And so our ability to make sure that we're organizing on the local level is so important. And then another piece that we wanted to talk about is leadership development. We can talk all day about running candidates. We can talk all day about shifting the climate, like shifting the culture, shifting the climate, but we need more soldiers in the field. We need more organizers. We need more people to be able to interrogate systems and actually be a part of the political debate that's going to generate the ideas that bring us closer to the transformative change that we need. And then lastly, as the Movement for Black Lives, we alone cannot lift the left. We alone cannot transform the system. Black people alone cannot and should not have to undo the systems that create the conditions for our oppression. And so we have to have a multiracial strategy, and we have to have an analysis that brings into account not only race, but class and gender, ability and religion, and so many other things that are so important to our individual lived experiences and the experiences of our communities as we think about building the necessary coalitions to actually bring people into the movement and contest for power. And so we have to think about power as something that is beyond the White House, that is beyond the 2020 election. But that's a really big thing. I can't say to you in November of 2019 that November of 2020 doesn't matter. All roads lead there, but hopefully all roads don't end there. Hopefully that's just the first stop in a longer conversation. And what's typically happened on the left in liberal spaces is that we get someone who's not as bad in the White House, and we take our hands off the wheel. And then we're responding again 4 years later. And so we're trying to think critically about what does it mean to build the infrastructure so that our movements grow stronger. We use elections as flashpoints to bring people further into the work, bring people further into our ideology. And we know that social movements are key to that. We know that the reason that folks are even contesting for things like, fighting the NRA in such a large way, thinking about taking off AR-10s off the streets are because we saw mass mobilizations by students in the last year. We know that the reason we're having conversations around abolishing the police and ending private prisons are because we've had so much work against the carceral state over the last few years. Even today, as people are thinking about immigration, as the DACA students are at the Supreme Court, we understand that these are all connected to social movements, and that is our strongest and our greatest tool. And we can't have a social movement just to remove a president. We have to have a social movement toward a vision. And so the Movement for Black Lives is thinking about that policy vision and those demands as center, and using that North Star to guide us through the terrain of making sure that we get Trump out of office, but also think about all the other seats, all the other institutions that need to be transformed along the way. So I'll stop there. I'm super interested to hear what everyone else has to say. But again, the kind of 5 pillars of this 5-year plan for us are the ability to mass engage. What we see the right doing, y'all, they mass they massively engage folks. They are winning the conversation on narrative. It might be simple, it is completely wrong, but their ability to talk to folks across class lines and racial lines is something that we need to study and then use to our advantage, because we actually have the better ideas to actually improve people's lived experiences, local power, electoral justice, leadership development, and multiracial solidarity. So the Movement for Black Lives convened a space called the Majority, where there are unions and political parties and other social movements sitting around the table to build an anti-racist left that is centered in that politics, to be thinking about all of these pillars again in a broader way as we move into and beyond 2020.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Kayla. So again, this is an opportunity for you all, if you're inspired or you're thinking of a question, just to jot it down on those sheets. And so just wanted to appreciate you for condensing that to about 5 minutes, 30 seconds. There you go. All right. So just lifting up that the work that Kayla is doing with the Electoral Justice Project is lifting up these kind of 4 pillars around mass engagement, true local power, leadership development, and building multiracial coalitions as a strategy forward. All right, give thanks. So we're going to move into Ted, and again, prompted by the same question, Ted, if you could state your position on what on left strategy that's needed to shift power beyond November 2020.
Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
Yes, good.
Okay, great. Happy to be here with you all tonight. So I'm speaking roughly on behalf of the Working Families Party. I'll do my best. And I think, unsurprisingly, maybe, given that our relatively new national director, Maurice Mitchell, came to us from within the Movement for Black Lives and has been very involved with the electoral justice work, I think a lot of what I'm going to say is pretty aligned with what Kayla just spelled out. You know, maybe it would have been even without Maurice, but with him, it certainly.
We're all on the same team.
Right. And maybe just a slightly different emphasis in a few places. But I want to start with just a little bit of what I think our analysis of the situation is, and then what the interventions that seem to us most promising in this moment are. So I think we all know that since the 1970s, at least, the American state has been overwhelmingly on the side of capital. And in its alliance with capital, the US state has either directly waged war on working people and their organizations, or cleared away the protections that at times prevented capital from waging the war itself. So long as neoliberalism delivered economic growth, which it did to some extent for some period of time, voter opposition to particular aspects of the neoliberal project could be ignored by crucial sections of the ruling class. But since the 2007 to 2009 crisis, really only Barack Obama's personal popularity kept neoliberalism's standard bearers within the Democratic Party in the saddle. Since 2016, they've been in complete crisis. For the most part, the Clintonite wing of the Democratic Party understands that they have no program, no real base, and that some shift to the left is necessary for the Democrats' electoral chances. But that wing of the party can't bring themselves to support measures that would meaningfully upend any aspect of the status quo, especially since it pays them so well. And with candidates like Sanders and Warren running for president on radical programs, and people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar setting the pace in Congress, no one would believe any left-wing posturing by them anyway. Meanwhile, Trump is so abhorrent to most Democratic voters, including many affluent ones, that it's extremely unlikely that even a Warren or a Sanders nomination would cause more than a few Democrats to defect in a general election. All of which means that it's genuinely possible that we could elect the most left-wing president in American history in 2020, a designation that I would argue would apply certainly to Bernie Sanders, but also to Elizabeth Warren. Meanwhile, the appearance on the scene of elected officials like AOC and also people like Kendra Brooks, who was just elected to the Philadelphia City Council on a third-party WFP ticket in a historic victory just last week. This has begun to shift political consciousness in this country, especially among young people, and my work, it seems to me, especially among young people of color. A tiny crack in the armor of cynicism that working class people in this country use to protect themselves from endless disappointment at the hands of politicians has opened up. People know that these candidates represent a genuine alternative, not just in terms of the policy positions that they articulate, but also in terms of their life experiences and where they come from, their class backgrounds, and how they see the world. And seeing candidates like that, my sense is that there's a hunger on the part of a pretty broad swath of people in this country for more of that. And so that's the good news, right? And electoral polarization along lines of race and region throws up huge challenges for any left program in this country right now. In particular, the counter-majoritarian institutions known as the US Senate and the Supreme Court are stocked with out-and-out reactionaries who know that a dwindling white majority can't hold power forever under democratic conditions. A resurgent left will not lead these reactionaries to search for compromises. It will lead them to search for ever more sinister ways to subvert popular rule. And if you throw in a touch of climate nihilism, which the right in America manifests, you've got a potentially very bad situation that we need to take really seriously. And the point of that is that even a huge Democratic landslide in 2020 could still leave us with a Republican control in the Senate, and will certainly leave us with right-wing control in the U.S. Supreme Court. So what is the left strategy that will most contribute to shifting the balance of forces beyond 2020? This seems to me to be absolutely the right question. The belief that one can shift the balance of forces through electoral work is a big part of why I first went to work at the Working Families Party more than a decade ago. So, unsurprisingly, I think elections can play a role in this if we approach them the right way. At least I think we can do a great deal to break the stranglehold that organized capital has over the state apparatus in the US. And that's an indispensable first step towards building a society that puts people and the planet ahead of profits. So I've got 4, maybe 5 things that I think that should orient the left approach. And I'll just sort of list them out quickly. They're not identical to Kayla's pillars, but they have some overlap. So first, I think we, and that's we in the left generally, we in the working class, in the Working Families Party certainly specifically, need to push candidates to campaign in a way that galvanizes the multiracial working class base that the left needs. The more that the presidential candidates in particular run and win on genuinely transformative demands, the more pressure it will place on congressional Democrats in particular to go along, and that's going to be a huge part of what has to happen after November 2020. Within the WFP, we're certainly pushing the candidates that we support to take a genuinely intersectional approach to really speak to issues of racial justice and gender justice at the same time as they're talking about the billionaires and how the system is rigged against all working people.
Ted, I'm just watching, you have about 30 seconds left.
Oh, okay, really quick. Go after down ballot opportunities. In the WFP, we're especially focused on places where state legislatures could flip from Republican to Democratic control, and to do so with left-wing candidates. Do real leadership development and get people invested in a long-term program of power building, which is going to be absolutely necessary after November 2020, because the fight is only going to intensify then. And then push in every way we know how for a Democratic president and Congress to prioritize measures that themselves will shift the balance of forces. And so in particular, I think labor law reform and sort of broadly speaking, democracy reform are 2 really crucial domains. And both of those are places where a creative and determined president can act even in the face of congressional opposition. And then lastly, just, we all have to get ready for mass mobilization on a scale that we've never seen if we actually want to, intervene at this moment to change the direction of things. So I'll leave it there. Looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you for sharing. Appreciate that you gave us kind of analysis of capital and its relation to the elections, dating back even as far as 2007 into the current crisis that happened in 2016 and to now this moment, and then sharing a few points that I think were overlapping with what Kayla shared, including leadership development, mass mobilization, and thinking about what measures, including labor law reform and democracy reform, that we need to push through. And you mentioned my hometown. Hey, Philadelphia. All right. So again, prompt to write your questions, thoughts, contentions, challenges. And we're going to move to Emily. Hi. Again, stating your position on what the left or left strategy needs to be to shift power beyond November 2020.
Hey everybody.
I'm going to pass you the mic.
Okay. So I think this question, it actually assumes that we win in 2020, and I don't think that's a given. So that's kind of the first thing I think is like, for me, we cannot shift power if we are not really focused on actually defeating Trump. And like we cannot even gain any ground because we will be in defensive positions for another 4 years. Or setting the stage for even beyond, really like right-wing control of all different parts of our legal system, judicial. It's just mind-boggling what we're up against if Trump wins again, and it's very likely he could win again, right? I think that is something that like I have nightmares about and I can't sleep sometimes because I'm like, oh my God, are we doing enough? Are we doing enough? Because I think if we cannot commit to the fact that we need to defeat Trump, then what are we doing answering this question? And I think that's one of the things that for me has been challenging is that first, let's commit to that and figure out what do we all need to do to defeat Trump. Because then we can actually start to talk about what does it mean to contest for power. If we're not contesting for power, then we are not actually developing strategy. And for me, the process of understanding, how do we think about the role that electoral strategy and electoral power building has to play in a broader picture of what building a left strategy is to defeat capitalism and to build an alternative to capitalism. A lot of it has required just being in the fight, like getting in the mud, right? Which is, for anybody who works in local politics, it's really muddy and it's pretty dirty and you have to contend with a lot of contradictions. But I think that's part of what we need to do is actually get in the contradictions of what does it mean to fight for power and to fight to govern. And that's what I think the role of leftists is to do actually, is that we should be in that fight and we should be leading other forces in that fight and cohering our other forces, whether it's in labor or environmental sector or the criminal justice fights. I think it's about us actually understanding how do you build power together, and that requires us to kind of get in it, which a lot of people don't want to do because it is really messy. And I think that, I definitely agree with Kayla and Ted around there's a lot of work to be done in order to build our ability to do that, because, I think a lot of it is around if we are to defeat kind of the right-wing forces at play in the looming fascism or current, that's happening, there's a level of investment we need to make around electoral strategy. And, it does take leadership development, mass mobilization. We have to actually develop people who can actually win, in the electoral arena. And then, the hard part is actually not the winning. The hard part is actually once they get into office, do we have an agenda for them? Do we have a platform? If we want bold, visionary leaders, we need bold, visionary agendas. And I think a lot of times we struggle with that when we're like, holy shit, we might actually win, Like, now what do? Like, do we have an agenda for this person to be pushing? Do we have people who are gonna go in and staff them? Who's gonna be their advisors once they're in office? Because they're in now for 4 years, so who's gonna commit to that? are we all gonna leave our, we're gonna leave our day jobs to go help somebody who's like now inside the system? So I think there's a lot of questions that come. The more we get into actually what does a left strategy look like, the more questions we're gonna have about how do you do this? How do you actually govern, or how do you co-govern with people who are in office? And I think that all starts at the local level. Like, we don't know how to do that on a national scale, so we can't do it on a local scale. So I think for us, the district attorney race was a huge upset, a huge, mind-boggling, like stunning victory, which many people in this room contributed to. And we're definitely following the lead of Philly and St. Louis and the Bronx, and so many inspiring cases of like what's possible. So I just want to say that I think like the hard part is actually us engaging in this and really committing to what is it. I don't think we can answer that question until we start doing this work, until you start engaging in the electoral fights and actually really looking at what does it look like to run your own candidate, what does it look like to then lose and then do it again and do it again and do it again until you win. And then once that happens, like that's actually the part that we're like most of us are inexperienced in the left, is like we don't actually know how to govern because most of us have not gotten in, right? And so I think that's just a real contradiction that we face, is that we don't have the experience actually, because it's not an arena that we've been. But I think it's really inspiring, because right now a lot of leftists are talking about what does it mean to have power. And I also am very inspired by this quote that I heard from Jane McAlevey, who's, we win at the scale of the power we build, right? So it's like we can win big, inspiring, bold things if we have the power to get there. But power is about us actually, like we have to seize that power, we have to contest for it. And so like we can put out a lot of great agendas, but if we don't actually have the grassroots army to get those people into office or to hold them accountable when they're in office, like it doesn't mean anything, right? So I just think that it goes hand in hand, and I'm really excited to hear people's questions and also the rest of the kind of fishbowl conversation we have. Thank you.
That's great.
Thank you. I really appreciate that, and appreciate what the speakers before me have said. I think I'm going to tackle this question from a kind of a back door, which is I want to talk about why, how my ideas about electoral politics have changed over the years, because I mean, my starting point is that, that I'm living in a settler colonial state that is wreaking havoc all over the world, and here among people of color and poor and working class people. And I really feel like, in terms of why I've been in this movement for 50 years, is that I want a world where, I want a decolonized world. I want a world where people who have been deprived of self-determination, like I think about the Puerto Rican independence struggle, I think about Palestine, I think about indigenous people, like people that politicians don't usually really consider in their calculus. So to me, I can't get to the world I want until there's like a really solid anti-colonial fight to address those historic wrongs. So for me, so I was one of those people who could not bring myself to throw down for Hillary Clinton in 2016. It just like went, it felt like it went against everything, every anti-imperialist bone in my body, to work for this warmonger. And I have to say my mind has really been changed from both the Trump victory, which I did not think could happen, really huge miscalculation politically. But my faith has always been and still is in the power of organized movements, and I feel like I'm in a struggle. I have been in a struggle to figure out what it means to hold this vision of the kind of world I want, and then also, as Emily's saying, like get in there and get scrappy and fight for power on different levels. And I've only worked on 3 like local electoral campaigns in my life, and I feel like, I'd like to get into more of the questions about how we see the relationship between community organizing, grassroots organizing, and how that relates to like a long-term struggle for power on the electoral level. But I feel like the Trump victory was a wake-up call to me, and I feel like we are, as other people have said, we are like in an incredibly dangerous position right now as in the world. I mean, authoritarian white nationalists are gaining ascendancy all over the world. There's incredible pushback by popular struggles, but it's a really terrifying moment. And the idea of another 4 years of a Trump administration terrifies me, because I feel like it would be like unrestrained power that would, you know, and I do completely agree that as a left, we have to make the, a one-term presidency for Trump you know, our highest priority, or one of our highest priorities. And I do really believe that we can't see the electoral arena to the right. They've had it for 40 years. We are paying the cost for that, and that that we really, yeah, that we have to unseat this administration, and that the only way to do that is on an electoral level at this moment. I also think that electoral work is one very important tool, one very important tool that we have in the left. I also, in our ecosystem, I also don't think it's the only one, and we can talk about this later. I mean, I do have concerns about how we, how we build a movement that is not totally tied to electoral power at every stage. And I really feel like this is a time where more people are being mobilized, that it's a huge missed opportunity if we don't engage people around this election. And I think that we need a more unified left. We desperately need a more unified left where we stop, you know, doing the circular firing squad with each other again and again. We can't afford it. Check. So, yeah. And I do have questions and concerns about how we engage in this work, and I want to hear what other people think about that too. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, so we're getting some questions together from folks. I'm actually going to pose a question. I have facilitator privilege. Okay, so there's some kind of threads that we heard in what everyone was sharing. And I think one thread that I heard almost everyone mention was this idea of leadership development, right? And so we know that elections and campaigns are just moments in time, right? They start, they end, they're like a project. They start and they end, right? But the opportunity to kind of build our forces is a lifelong opportunity. Some folks call that leadership development, base building. So if folks could talk a little bit about when you share leadership development, what does that look like in your organization towards the election season and beyond the election season? And maybe I'll actually start with you, Kayla, because I think you were the first one to call it out as a tenet in your organization.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I think, you know, leadership development, the kind of audience of that changes where you are in your work. And so there's this kind of individual leadership development. So I was a pharmacy technician in 2014. Mike Brown is murdered. I become a protester. I find out all the ills of capitalism and this hetero patriarchy, and become a deep Black feminist. There's like that didn't happen overnight. There was like intentional investment that happened from organization, right? So I believe deeply that all leadership is connected to organization in the same way that you learn in the classroom. You politically, your consciousness raises in relationship to organization. I think then there's the expansion of skills and capacity of those who have been somewhat developed, who are moved into more formal things like positions of organizing. How do we make sure that the folks who come in the door as organizers are then moved into the space to be able to do things like fundraise and strategize and vision and things like that. And then for the Electoral Justice Project, one of the things that we think about for development is organization. So the Movement for Black Lives is comprised of, over 100 organizations, with the overwhelming majority of them being 501c3s. And so in the conversation when we talk about contesting for power, we needed to first identify why there were not so many Black 501c4s. There were not so many PACs that were owned by community and, driven by community. And what we found was that it was a lack of development and access to the information and the capacity to hold those systems. And so as a project, what we try to do is like develop and strategize in partnership with the organization. So there are executive directors who are now thinking about how to build out C4s and PACs and work. And so, you're never in a position of not needing to be developed as a leader. But it's so important, because how do we get from the person who sees something like this event on a flyer and then is able to be on this panel at the event? And we have to, if we don't constantly develop that, then what will happen is we'll create a hierarchical structure where there's a very elite top, and then our movement will appear top down in a way that is not generative and not long lasting. And so if people don't see if they show up to the movement and the movement doesn't show up in them, then they're not going to keep coming back, right? And so how do we intentionally think about, leadership development and beyond building the base? Because we have a base of a lot of folks who don't know a lot of things, but they like us. But how do we build them into leaders, right? Beyond the constituency, that they are actually a part of and invested in the work and can share the analysis and can have the same, values and beliefs that we have as a entity, as an organization, as a broader movement. That's where we need to strive. That's what we need to strive for, so that there are a million Kaylas, and there aren't organizers who are the exception, but are the norm.
Thank you. We would appreciate a million Kaylas. That would be great. All right, Emily, I'm going to pose kind of the same question to you around leadership development, right? And so Kayla talked about part of their work around leadership development is thinking about organizations building their political power from 501c3s to 501c4. I know that your organization is a 501c4. So can you talk about the connection between that and leadership development?
Yes. So we have a 501c4 in addition to a C3, but in full disclosure, that C4 has largely been unfunded for the majority of its existence, in the sense that most of there are no institutions that really fund C4s, especially in San Francisco, where there's an assumption that San Francisco's got all the, it's already super progressive, it doesn't need any C4 money, or, doesn't need to be pushed more to the left. And so for us, developing the C4 has been basically saying, we're gonna invest in leaders who are willing to mostly donate and volunteer their time. And, we use our C4s in some ways as largely to, work on election cycle to cycle. And we are able to, basically develop partnerships or, contracts with independent expenditures, sometimes with campaigns, and then we're able to, pay people, essentially. But it's very cyclical, it's very short term. It usually doesn't allow for leadership development because we don't have sustained funding, right? And for whatever you do, you have to have some kind of sustained resource, and we don't have that in our C4 for the most part. I think still, how do we use, even without funding, without a lot of money in your C4, you can still do a lot of leadership development, because elections are actually a very good way to do leadership development, and you do it every day, and you do it very robustly until your election ends. So it's very different than most of our C3s, right? Where it's leadership institutes, and we're going for months, and we're doing campaigns that might be more than a year long, and there's a very much longer term engagement. And with elections, you're really okay, you're gonna learn how to talk to somebody, you're gonna learn how to talk to a stranger and knock on their door, and you've never done that before. And so that's a real hard skill that we're teaching our grassroots leaders and our members and our volunteers. And you're not only having to do those hard things like talk to strangers, but you also have to convince them of something. You have to persuade them. I'll say this, if you can be a paid canvasser in an election, and you can last your whole election, you can do anything. Because you have literally done the hardest job, one of the hardest jobs. is like just going out like day after day, talking to people, they slam the door in your face. You have to convince people that what you have to say is worth their time, you know? And you're often competing with a bunch of other people who are trying to do that too. So if you can do that, you can be an amazing organizer because you can talk to people. And you can not only talk to people, you can translate complex ideas into something that matters to someone's everyday life. So I think there's a ton of leadership development that happens on election doors that actually, you know, looks very different than what we do in some of our longer term movement organizing or base building work. And it's an important skill. I think it complements some of the longer term stuff very well. And oftentimes we are training our grassroots leaders. We're training monolingual, Latinx, you know, domestic workers who are undocumented. Or we're training monolingual, you know, restaurant workers or, you know, folks who are living in single room occupancies and who they can, you know, we're actually providing workforce development and that's an opportunity to actually for people to develop their skills. And I think that's really important for our people to be able to say, yeah, I know how to go out and talk to somebody I've never talked to them before, and I can talk about housing issues, I can talk about why we need a higher living wage, I can talk about why actually just locking people up in jail is not the solution, it's a cycle and it's a waste of resources. They're translating all these really complex theoretical things actually to people's real lives. And that's actually what we in the left need to learn how to do better, I think. And so elections force us to do that. They force us to talk to like scale, thousands of people, you know, which we normally don't do. So I think there's a lot, and there's so much leadership development that we can do using elections, and then we have to figure out how are we making sure that we're doing that year round and not, it doesn't end on election day, right? And that's about what is the longer term, how do we incorporate the base building into the electoral work? Do you actually have a plan to talk to those people again before the next election? You know, those canvassers who you trained, what's their next level of, you know, are they leading volunteers next time? Are they leading a team of people next time? So I think there's a lot.
All right, thanks for that. I was transported back to when I was like 17 years old, or 18 years old, knocking on the doors in South Central with agendas. So, yeah, you can. You can get doors slammed in your face and feel good about your life. It's great. All right, y'all. So we have a couple questions that we're going to take from these note cards that I have here. I'm going to do it. I'm just going to ask this question because I knew it was going to come up. All right, this is a question for Ted. So I'm going to read it verbatim. It's not representative of Liz and or CPE. I can't tell you how disappointing it was to hear of the Warren endorsement. I was thinking of dropping my support to WFP. Can you tell me why, if you're trying to build a transformative movement, if the WFP still feels the move was the right thing to do, or if there's a reconsideration of this, at the very least, a dual endorsement with Sanders? You can take a breath after that, it's all good. It's all good.
Well, I'm trying to think of for this particular conversation that makes most sense to address that question. I mean, the first thing I want to say is in terms of the WFP's decision to have a process that would lead to an endorsement, setting aside for a second the question of who won that process, and this goes to the question about why a dual endorsement we ruled out as an approach from the start. The analysis within the WFP that was shared amongst leaders, staff, grassroots activists, and so on, was that the corporate wing of the Democratic Party, the neoliberal wing of the Democratic Party, was very quickly consolidating around their preferred candidate, and that should that wing of the party prevail in the Democratic primary and nominate someone like Joe Biden, not only would that be likely a catastrophe electorally, given that, you know, whatever polling says, our view is that, you know, someone running on a centrist program at this point in time is just going to have a massively demobilizing effect on the base, in along the lines that Hillary Clinton did in 2016, where even, you know, if all the same voters who had switched from Obama to Trump did so, she still would have won if the turnout hadn't collapsed in places like Philadelphia and Detroit and Milwaukee, and we know this, right? So our analysis was that that would be a disastrous situation. And so if that was the case, it was crucial, it was necessary to get off the sidelines, to pick a candidate and then to do work. You can't do work on behalf of two candidates. You can publicly express your support for two candidates, but you can't do real work. And so we designed a process that was true to the WFP's history and nature as an organization, as a party that is both that is a hybrid of a membership organization and a coalition of organizations. We designed a process that respected that culture, those traditions, that gave 50% of the weight of our vote to our grassroots membership and online supporters, and 50% of the weight to our state chapters, which themselves ran their own democratic processes, and our national organizational partners. And that produced a pretty resounding victory or a pretty resounding endorsement in favor of Elizabeth Warren, who across the board was viewed within our organization as someone who has pretty extraordinary gifts in terms of in terms of her ability to articulate what's gone wrong in America, who did it, and what we can do about it. And so there were many people in the party, and continue to be many people in the party, who believe strongly that should she become president, she would be an extraordinarily effective person at doing what I articulated earlier, which is actually pushing through some measures that would shift the balance of forces, that would open up spaces for organizing and for building power on the left. And I don't think nothing that has happened has changed that assessment. I do want to say one other thing, though, which is that we have been clear, the WFP has been clear, and Maurice has been clear in every public statement he's made, that we in no way, shape, or form see this as an endorsement against Sanders. We opened up our process to anyone who was interested in it. There were 5 or 6 candidates who took it seriously, but no one who was paying attention was under any doubt that one way or another it was going to go to either Sanders or Warren. And from our point of view, it is a tremendous thing to have 2 structural change candidates in the race who are, if anything, pushing each other to articulate bolder and more visionary and more comprehensive positions about what's possible in this moment. We are not in our work trying to go out and convince Bernie Sanders voters that they should abandon their candidate and go to Elizabeth Warren. We're trying to convince all the people, and there are many, many, many people who have not made up their minds, or people who are tempted by, some of the more mainstream centrist candidates. If Bernie Sanders pulls way ahead and we want the left to unify, and we will be working assiduously to bring that about in every way that we know how.
All right. Next question, right, quickly, next question. Thanks, Ted. So, the last thing that you ended on was the importance of kind of unifying the left, right? And so I have another question that's here. So how do you address, and how do we address, the justified concerns from cynical members of the left that attempting to gain political power through the electorate within bourgeois democracy is a futile goal, and how do we address those concerns? It's futile to try and do this in a bourgeois democracy. Emily, are you smiling because you have some thoughts?
I do, but I agree. I just think that what we saw with this race with Chesa Boudin was like every single person we talked to, every disenfranchised person we talked to was critical. Like talking to working class, poor, low income, people of color who were themselves formerly incarcerated or had family members who were incarcerated. Like, if you want to talk to those people and you talk to them about like what that platform was of like mass decarceration and ending cash bail and about rehabilitation and diversion programs and mental health, I just feel like the responses we got from people who were directly impacted was so clear that it's not futile because they are directly impacted, and they were saying, okay, sounds like somebody who cares about what I think and I would have benefited if he was the DA, you know, instead of, you know, all the previous ones. Like, that really makes a difference in people's lives. It's like, that's real change. And like, it has an impact. And I just feel like if you hear those stories and you're on those doors talking to those people, like, we talked to so many people who were social workers at juvenile hall, people who were, you know, talked about stories of how their family got into financial hardship for years because they had to pay bail for, you know, a family member who was, you know, and it was just very moving, I think, because that is what, like, it is very clear when you talk to regular people, like, they see the impact themselves very clearly. It's not a question for them if it's futile or not, and I think that sometimes we're so far removed from those people and so far removed from the real impact on everyday people that it becomes this very theoretical concept to us, but actually there's some very concrete things and that happen when you engage in electoral politics. And of course, it helps that Chesa was the most progressive candidate and a public defender, and, you know, himself was the son of incarcerated parents. There was so much there that makes him a very unique candidate. A lot of our candidates are not like that. But I think there's just an opportunity we're missing if we're not seeing the real impact we can have on people's lives and to keep pushing. You know, it's not like he's still, you know, he's still in the system, he's still the DA, but what can he do is transform that office. We need to transform every single public office we have, from the mayor to the president to like the DA. Like, none of them are meant to serve us right now. So we need to get people in who are willing to work with us to transform what it looks like, and to a certain point, right? But we don't know what, like, we need to figure out what our next thing looks like, right? If we don't know what the other system, the alternative to capitalism is, and we don't know that until we actually go in and have to govern ourselves. So I think there is an important like practice here of like engaging with the struggle of, it's not futile, it's hard, it's a lot of hard work. It's like very difficult, right? Because we have not been able to do that in the United States ever. So there's a lot of this like, you know, revolutionary imagination that's required, and then actually revolutionary practice. How do you practice the act of governing? And that's what we're trying to do when we elect these progressives or, you know, people like Chase who are actually leftists into office. So I think there's just a, it's this whole process of like, yeah, it's we can't give up on it because actually it's what we have right now, and it's not like we're gonna just sit around and do nothing until we have socialism, right? I mean, I assume so, but we're not just sit around and do nothing, so.
Yeah, can I get in on this?
Yes, I'm gonna give it to you, Kayla, and then I'd like to hear from Donna as well.
For sure.
You know, I think the question about it being futile is like, I disagree with that, and here's why. I think it is the responsibility of the left and our movement to do two things. One, we have to move our people toward a bold, radical, transformative vision for our society. And two, we have to mitigate harm right now in order to realize that tomorrow. And if we don't mitigate harm right now within the systems that impact our daily lives, then we actually won't build the base necessary to move people toward transformative change. If I can't see you winning now, I'm not going to go with you down the road. And so people understand elections as how they impact us right now. And so even as someone who's like, you know, deeply reading and trying to become a student of abolition, I understand that my work to elect carceral-minded, like decarcerate, you know, reform-minded, I don't like the word progressive prosecutor, but whatever, you know, like in that relationship, we have to think about, are we able to mitigate harm right now for our people that makes it more likely that when we go to base bill, when we go to knock on their doors, they're not suffocating under the weight of these systems so that they can't come out, right? We canvass so many neighborhoods that say, oh, come to our meeting about closing this jail or reforming cash bail. And they're like, boo, I got somebody locked up right now. I don't have time for that. I'm struggling to pay my rent. And so right now, if we're actually talking about building a movement of working class people who are actually like really deeply suffering in the context of right now, we can't think of elections as futile. We have to think of it as a way to actually help our folks to be able to grow our movement and to practice this thing around governance so that when it comes time to draw something new, we have some experience to know what to do and what not to do. And so I think, you know, we have to shift our thinking around it. It's definitely not our salvation, but it definitely helps to make people's day-to-day a lot easier when we get it right.
That's great, thank you for sharing. I'm going to pass it to Donna as well to kind of respond to this, is because you shared that you were a disbeliever maybe of sorts, and so now you've moved a bit. So how would you talk to folks who are on that trajectory as well?
I feel like something that's been very compelling to me has been like to see the actual effect of having the squad in Congress, the ways that their presence, even though they're definitely not a majority and they're disrespected by the leaders of the Democratic Party, they still, like, they've moved the question of Palestine and Zionism and BDS in a way that I never thought would be possible. So I think the thing about the ways that having electeds in power opens up political space on a more local level. Like I worked for the campaign for Nikki Bass in Oakland for the city council, and have been really impressed with the ways that, again, it's not like a majority on the council, but she's been able to like really bring the issues that are confronting people in Oakland into the council chambers, and to really be a force for, you know, pushing the needle to the left. So I mean, I feel like those are some of the things that have moved me, like just seeing in action the effects. And also, you know, I'll just tell you a little story. I also worked a little bit on Chase's campaign. I was in the Weather Underground with his parents many years ago, and it was kind of, I'm thinking, okay, here I am, this abolitionist, and I never thought I would be working to get a DA. Somebody who's, you know, I was in prison, I know what DAs do. You know, but I feel like, you know, watching the momentum that was built around him, and also his, seeing his platform and being able, you know, feeling like, okay, this is, I can be a phone banker for this person. I can urge people to vote for him, because even though I know it's a, you know, to my mind, a somewhat contradictory position, but it also, as Kimmy was pointing out, like the platform that Emily, the platform that he represented, that, you know, that he ran on, really raised issues around racial justice, around a lot of the things that I think are really critical for us to be talking about. So, and I think the thing about like how do we jive this with our, you know, our long-term vision and our hopes for the kind of world we want, with being involved in a process that we know is less than perfect, as Kimmy was saying, you know, it's messy. Like it's not. I mean, I remember in one of the conversations I had phone banking, I was talking to this woman who was actually, you know, was an undecided voter, and I gave her the pitch about why to vote for Chesa, and she said, well, what about quality of life issues, like my car's been broken into, and tried to talk to her about like trying to deal with root causes about why these things happen. And then she said, well, does he want anybody, like is he going to send anybody to jail? So, you know, part of his platform was I'm going to test make sure that every rape kit that hasn't been tested will be tested, which then the follow up to that is I'm going to send people to prison, you know, or, you know, probably for that. And I feel like, okay, my little abolitionist heart is going, ugh. And also the thing about, you know, like the race politics, like she was, as soon as I said that, she said, I'll vote for him. And and it was just one of those things that it was realizing that, okay, maybe it was because she was a survivor of sexual violence, and that was something. It also could have been, you know, that's what could have moved her, and it also could have been like, you know, like the politics of law and order in terms of sexual abuse and sexual harm done, and people see that as the only way. And so, you know, the part of me that wanted to like be able to have a whole conversation with her about the ways that rape has been used in this country against men of color, you know, like that deeper kind of conversation that you can't really do when you're phone banking, let's be honest. So, but to me, the take home from that is like we need both of those things. We need that deep work where we really help people like develop their understanding of the ways the system does not serve us. And I also feel like, you know, like a lot of the work that I do is working with other white folks again to challenge white supremacy. And I feel like to engage in electoral politics right now is actually pretty important, because the white vote has been, you know, has been totally critical in keeping people like Trump in power. And I feel like until we can like talk to other, you know, like for white, you know, when people of color say to us, come and get your cousins, the electoral arena is a pretty important place to come and get our cousins. And, you know, and I know like Linda Burnham has pushed us about, you know, if we don't find a way to talk to white people about their pain, and we can be quite sure that somebody else will. So I feel like we both have to challenge people about white supremacy and also find ways for them to like find their stake in this struggle in a different kind of world. And anyway, so I just feel like the thing about how do we hold on to our long-term visions and still do this work that is going to be less than perfect. It's the time, place, and conditions that we're in. I also want to point people to something that I just found on Facebook the other day, which is, this is from a group of abolitionist writers and thinkers like Ruthie Gilmore and a number of other people, and it's called From Abolitionist Principles and Campaign Strategies for Prosecutor Organizing. And it totally like hit the mark for me about how can you do this in a way where you're not selling out your politics and your long-term vision. And you, anyway, I highly recommend it. It's a really good read. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for that. And I think we'll be able to send that out as a resource for all folks who signed in. So thanks for giving us attention to that.
Yes, shout out to that. I was so happy to see that. At the case when I was coming in, and when I got, you know, I was like, oh my God, we're not far off. She just, you know, when I was living in so much to think, you know, like, I don't want us to talk. I just want us to not talk about it, but yeah, we'll get that.
Right on. Got to double click on that one then. All right, y'all. So there is this question. So you talked about kind of the importance of this moment and electoral organizing is that you're able then to have real conversations with folks who are dealing with working class struggles, right? And kind of think about how do we merge the radical and revolutionary imagination with what's actually happening on the ground. So how do we raise contradictions for folks in their everyday lives to then talk about these issues and to think about how do then we move our talk into actual mobilizing power. And so there's a question here that this person is asserting that we need both electoral work and beyond electoral work, right? And so how do we conceive of a movement that uses direct action with electoral campaigns? And what are some examples? We can also kind of draw on, as folks are thinking a little bit about it, we can draw on what's happening globally now, right? So Paris, Beirut, Santiago, Hong Kong, where else? Bolivia just the other day, right? Morales stepped down. All folks who are in the streets now over, shitty governments, really corrupt governments, right? And so though they are standing up in their hometowns and their home countries, and so the question is, how do we kind of how do we conceive of a movement that brings direct action with electoral campaigns?
I mean, I'm happy to discuss. So I think that like direct action is very important, and we've seen it happen in mass, like all the countries that you just talked about, and we've seen it happen, you know, after the inauguration with the Women's March and things like that, where there are mass mobilizations into the streets. And then we've seen it in a particular way to actually push candidates who are on the same spectrum or more politically aligned with you and not just opposition, right? And so sometimes when you think about bird dogging or direct action, we think about the right. There actually needs to be a lot of pressure on us versus the centrists and the leftists to continue to push. And so, I want in 2020, that bird dogging it's not seen as like divisive, it's not seen as something that discourages people from participating, but it's actually seen as a tool of working class people to leverage, because we don't have the money and the lobbyists and all the folks who go behind the curtain to negotiate a thing. And that is actually how you push a candidate to the left. And so we saw it happen in 2016, and then we saw the response to that was actually kind of anti-democratic in the way that it wanted to kind of suppress the ways that we were agitational around Clinton, and even some BLM activists were agitation around Bernie. And I guarantee you, had not Black people been loudly critical of Bernie Sanders in 2016, his racial analysis would not have expanded to the point that he is now. And so I think that, in the same, like a conscious raising, an aware community is thinking about how do my low dollars help build organizations, how do direct actions help push conversations, how does political education help strengthen our base. All of these things have to be invoked right now. We actually want to move the ball some.
Could I jump in also?
You sure can.
Great. At the Working Families Party, we are trying to build something that is full of contradictions, but nevertheless to be a party that has space for institutional actors like labor unions, individual activists who are out there, without a political home, people's organizations of various sorts, and social movements, precisely because movements have an incredible ability to reveal contradictions, make them visible, and activate people around them. But they have a tendency to well up and then also to wind down very quickly sometimes, without necessarily institutionalizing or crystallizing the power in a way that can translate into governance. And so with the party, we're trying to create a structure that allows movements and movement actors to come very easily into the space, and to help us design electoral strategy that leads to concrete electoral wins on the basis of demands that movements are articulating. So we see that as a very organic and complementary relationship, and we are working constantly to forge the kinds of relationships with social movements and movement actors that build the kind of trust and the kind of solidarity that make that sort of joint strategizing to make it work.
So one thing that you lifted up, Ted, is this idea of raising contradictions and kind of then matching that to action, right? But the piece I don't want to lose is that there's an importance to raising the contradictions, right, in order to shift the narratives. So there's a person in the audience that asked, what successes have you seen in the narrative debates, that is, left ideas that are now more known or more accepted during this time, and how did that happen?
I think folks have already said this, there's a lot of examples right now because we actually have two very strongly progressive candidates now running who are serious contenders, and that was not true 3 years ago, and it definitely wasn't true 8 years ago. So I think that a lot has shifted because the moment has shifted politically, and I think we owe a lot of that to grassroots movements, right? Movement for Black Lives, the undocumented immigrant rights movements, there's just so many, I think there's been so much that has happened in the last 10 years that have shifted us. And the fact that Medicare for All is now something that mainstream candidates have to answer whether they support or not is a freaking huge deal. That is a big deal. And if we can't recognize that, then we need to, we need to be more grateful or something about how much opportunity we have right now in this moment. We have so much opportunity that we did not have 3 years ago or 10 years ago to talk about really fundamentally shifting some basic ideas about like who deserves what and who should have access to what, you know, and what's a basic human right. So I think the fact that we have presidential candidates who are talking about what they're going to do about student loans and debt forgiveness is huge. And I think even with this DA race, what we saw was that it became common sense that, oh, it's wasteful. The current system of incarceration is actually a waste of resources, and it's unjust and it's racist. Those are not things that I think in previous DA races were talked about at all. So I think that, and we owe that to Movement for Black Lives and just the kind of scrutiny and the uplifting of what Black communities are facing, what brown communities are facing, and how that has become something that's like, that's not acceptable. So if that's not acceptable, then what type of person are we going to elect into office? So I think there's a lot that has shifted, that we're in this kind of really exciting period of like, we can do a lot more. Like, we can get bold candidates with bold visionary agendas. But do we have them? Like, where are they? You know, do we have people that we know locally that are like, oh, of course, this person's so ready to run. They have a bold agenda, or, you know, they're a viable candidate, they could actually win. So I think there's a lot to say about like, the moment is right, but where are our people? Do we have leftists who are running for office? You know, and I think to go back to the other question is like, we need more people who are doing direct action to do some electoral work, and we need some electoral people to go do some direct action, you know? Like, the two have always been very separated, and the reality is we need to, like, you know, force some, you know, politicians to do some direct action, some legislative aides, and some, you know, and then we gotta get the direct action people to go knock some doors. I think there's just something about this moment that's like, all of us need to like kind of stretch ourselves to do something a little bit different, and push what we can imagine can happen in the electoral arena or in the direct action kind of like that arena. And we're gonna end soon, right?
We sure are. I gotta go home.
I just have to make a real quick pitch because I didn't do this. Really quick in 30 seconds, I have to pitch the Seed the Vote project that we've been working on because Hasmin told me to and I forgot to do it.
You did not follow my instructions, but I'm gonna give it to you. It's all good.
Really quick, you know, I talked earlier before about if we're, you know, we can't be talking about strategy if we're not committed to actually winning this next fight in front of us, because we will not be doing strategy, we'll be doing defense for a long time. So if we actually care about that, there's a really important project that Hasmin and myself and other volunteers have been working on called Seed the Vote. And it's basically how are we getting Bay Area folks, volunteers, to go out to swing states that are close by, like Nevada, like Arizona, and actually making an impact, right? We know that after the early primary here in California, we're going to be kind of irrelevant. I mean, there's a lot of important local fights, there's statewide fights, but also if we want to defeat Trump, then we need to be sending some capacity over to those nearby swing states and working with some local organizations to build their capacity as well. And so we're excited to announce that we are partnering officially. One of the partners in Arizona is Lucha, which has done a lot of amazing work around immigrant rights organizing in the state. They've run huge statewide campaigns. They're going to be running operations in Latinx communities and beyond, doing Spanish language and English, door knocking and phone making to get out the vote and make sure that Arizona does not get won by Trump. So folks who are interested, we're asking volunteers to just commit to do 2 weeks, very short part of your life, 2 weeks, the most critical 2 weeks of the election in October of next year. And you can sign up online. It's at seedthevote.org. And it's a really exciting project. Encourage folks to go check it out. And it's one way that for those of us who toss and turn at night of like, what if I didn't do enough? What if we wake up again on election day of regret that we did not do enough to make sure Trump is defeated? You know, this has been something that we can pour our energy into to really say the Bay Area can have an impact, right? So that's my plug.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I want to honor that what I've heard, like from Kayla and Ted and from Emily, is kind of lifting up the importance of the movement for Black Lives and the network, the global network, and kind of hoping to kick the door open for many opportunities and efforts now. And then also just want to be thoughtful that, the movement of Black Lives is an organization and a network that helped to grow its demands and its ideas and its thoughts and its philosophy and ideology from many organizations that preceded it, right? So just thinking about Malcolm X Grassroots Movement and People's Hurricane Relief Fund and Right to the City and all those organizations that helped to kind of craft these demands, right? That then in a moment in time exploded into some really great work now. So honoring our organizations that came before us as well. And also seeding, the vote was seeding ideas for new paths forward and seeding opportunity for new candidates. So some of the organizations that are thinking about, well, what does it really mean to kind of develop a candidate, right? To create opportunities for this person to then think about how to govern in city council, local council, state. And so there's some organizations that are doing that now, right? Supermajority is an organization founded by Ai-jen Poo and Alicia Garza, kind of thinking about how do we develop women candidates in particular. So Supermajority, Higher Heights has been doing it as well, thinking about Black women, how do we develop those candidates. And so I want to offer a question to you, Kayla, as well. So thinking about Electoral Justice Project, what kind of work are you all doing to, or how are you thinking about the development, particularly of women candidates, and how can gender justice and electoral and election organizing, electoral organizing, kind of be married?
That's a really good question. So, you know, when we first started the project, we did kind of a landscape analysis of the broad electorate and found that, like, you know, women were maybe like 30% of elected officials, and that might be high. It's 1037, so I'm fading. But Black women were even like less than that. And, you know, and then at the same time, understanding that Black women are the overwhelmingly, the most like consistent demographic of voters in the Democratic Party, really, period. Like across, like when you take out political ideology, like Black women as an identity group show up more than most other demographics when compared side by side. And overwhelmingly so, what we saw were that issues were not being centered around that conversation. And so I, you know, not to re-bring up a conversation, but I'm on the steering committee for a project called Black Women Forward that's not attached to the movement for Black Lives, but is a space where Black women are contesting with conversations around policies that directly impact our lived experiences. And so I think for us, you know, our project is ran by 3 women, Jessica Bird, Kayla Reed, and myself. And we, even within the movement for Black Lives, it is overwhelmingly women who are running these organizations, contesting with these strategies. And, you know, we have this kind of patriarchal, historical, ahistorical understanding of movements, but women have always been in the forefront and the background and underneath and on top of our movement. And so how do we like center those conversations and make direct investment? And so part of the work that we've really tried to do is expand beyond the conversation of what's electoral organizing, because if you are thinking about reproductive justice work, or if you're thinking about, you know, criminal justice work, or, you know, not criminal justice, carceral state work, then those have relationships to elections. And you might not be an electoral organizing entity, but your work overlaps with these systems in such a way. And so we decided to make direct, you know, our biggest project has been just moving me directly to those organizations that can't get to the tables where traditional democratic adjacent organizations are able to get a lot of funding to expand their work, to have a conversation about the intersection of the issue area that they are working on to relate to kind of the local context organized. And so I think it's very central to our work. It's very evident in the way that we move resources. And, you know, even broadly within the movement for Black Lives, one of the things that was lifted up in the policy platform after 2016 was that there was a lacking gender analysis in the way that we talked about policy. So we are in the relaunch, there's an intentionality to ensure that we are thinking about gender, accessibility, and other things that we did not center in the ways that we needed to in 2016 as we think about relaunching the 2.0. And so it's been a very reflective point, and I, you know, also think that we are trying to build, you know, EJP is kind of what we would want our legacy to be, is that we invested in organizations and that organizations were able to grow in relationship to our project. And so you don't see the Electoral Justice Project out front. You see us move in collaboration with our organizations. that make up the movement for Black Lives. And those organizations have really lifted the conversation around gender justice in a way that I don't think would have happened in the last 5 years. And so we're excited to just continue to move capacity to them.
Could I just say one small thing on this question? Very small, which is that the question of training candidates, and also we think training campaign managers and people who are skilled in running campaigns is hugely important. And traditionally, women and gender nonconforming folks have been not invested in that way. And so within the WFP, where we have historically done a ton of candidate and campaign manager training, about 2 years ago, we started a program called Women Run Campaigns, which is training specifically for women and gender nonconforming folks in both being candidates and being campaign managers. And we've done that training all over the country with several hundred people at this point, and then do work to sort of plug those folks in, the people who are being trained to run campaigns, to actually plug them into opportunities to carry out that work in different parts of the country. So having that infrastructure that can do that sort of work, I think is crucial to advancing the goal.
That's great. Thank you, both of you, for sharing that. Yeah, the importance of creating space for women, creating space for gender nonconforming folks, kind of centering the analysis around gender justice and electoral organizing in a way that hasn't been kind of considered in the last few years. So giving thanks for the organizations that do that, knowing that it's also gender justice, electoral organizing, and a radical politic, because we don't just want folks who identify a certain way making backwards-ass decisions when they get into office, right? I want to do a time check because I want to be thoughtful. I got 5 minutes, thank you. So let's see. I think I'm going to take these last 5 minutes to give folks the opportunity to give some last comments. Yeah, because it's quite late where you all are. So maybe we'll start again both with Ted and Kayla. Just last comments, maybe 1 minute. We'll start with Kayla.
Yes, you. Tell Rakia I said hello.
I feel like I'm always going first. And I'm sorry, the audio is getting worse. I'm supposed to give a last comment?
Yeah, just like we're wrapping up and we're taking our last few minutes.
Yeah, so
last closing thoughts.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I'll say is I think it's really important that this election we really try to shift the dominant narrative around electability to have a conversation about policy as it pertains to what we want to see. And I think our folks have been they've been given the Kool-Aid around the Democratic Party so much that they think that there's kind of a natural pipeline of who should be president, right? Like I hear people all the time like, well, Joe Biden was the vice president. Clearly, he would make the most sense. And I think we have to really engage in like deep political debate. There was a conversation earlier about someone saying I thought about leaving the Working Families Party, and this is actually a time to lean in, not walk out. And so, if we want to have the kind of movement where we are long lasting and have real transformative impact, we have to be ready to engage in political debate amongst ourselves so that we are actually a united front to the opposition. We're not each other's opposition. We have to think of ourselves as a family. Some people like this dessert, some people like that dessert, but we're still at the same table, right? And so we have to figure out how to translate our really big ideas into accessible things for our people and make it where they are able to come into this work and be moved into a pipe. Also, like one of the biggest things that we have to do in 2020 is challenge this notion of electability and really bring into, like we have the opportunity to bring into conversation a really amazing conversation around class that has kind of taken the backseat to, individualized conversations around race. And we know that they're intimately connected, that we live in a racialized capital system. We live under racialized capitalism. And so in order for us to actually like teach our people, move our people, build with our people, we have to have both of those things. And I think with the Warren and the Sanders, there's so many local elected officials, just like we are talking about the White House, but really we almost saw a Black woman become governor in Georgia last year. Like we are moving at the speed of our movement. our movements are inspiring people to run who otherwise maybe didn't think that it was possible. And so we could really win if we take the time to actually like lean into this moment and make sure that our folks are not thinking about who's most likely to beat Trump, but who's most likely to change my lived experience and bring about policies that will improve my material conditions. And I just think that that's a conversation. And so I encourage folks to, like, if we don't believe in a two-party system and we believe that, voting is futile, that's why we need a working family party. We need them to break the Democratic Party so that the left flank actually is able to build independent political power in such a way that we get to bring about and realize these policies that we just talked about in rhetoric and not got to put into practice.
Thanks, Kayla. We're gonna move to you, Ted. What I pulled from Kayla is the importance of a united left, right? That we're all at one table, and as we have political disagreements, that it's still an opportunity for us to unite, to think about how to break down the Democratic Party and build beyond that.
I just throw one thought out there, which is sort of in response to the question that someone raised earlier about bourgeois democracy. And, I don't think there's any debate that the American state is a capitalist state. It is the capitalist state of all capitalist states. And that is likely to remain the case for some time. But I think if we're serious about a project of social transformation, if we're serious about tackling the climate crisis in particular, we have to get a foothold in that state in order to initiate some process of social transformation. And it's our job to have an orientation towards what we would do with any measure of state power that we were able to win. But I would argue, until I'm blue in the face, that there isn't a path that goes outside of that to the kind of transformation that we need. So I don't think that means that we have to be dishonest about what's going on. I don't think that means that we have to pretend that it's something that it isn't. I think we have to be very rigorous and very clear with folks about what it means to engage in something like non-reformist reforms or structural reform or whatever you want to call it. But the idea that we need to take power for the sake of initiating a process of social transformation. That to me is the orientation.
Great. Taking power, ending capitalism, running themes.
Emily, I'm going to pass it to you. What Ted said, I think that's, I agree. And I don't know. I mean, I feel like sometimes when I get depressed, I go onto Twitter and I'll read like Cardi B tweets because like she's on point and she's like following the election and calling it like it is. She's like, yeah, I mean, she met with Bernie. She endorsed or whatever, she supports him, right? And then she's also like, I don't know, right now none of those candidates have enough base. Like, do they have the big enough base to beat Trump? I'm just kind of like, I don't see it, and it's like, okay, she's right. We gotta like figure out how are we building the base that's gonna defeat Trump, and I think that's just like the call of like that is our role as leftists is to actually like figure out, yeah, maybe we don't end up with a Warren or Bernie, like that's possible too. I mean, hopefully we do, but if we don't, and it's a Biden, then yeah, it's like we gotta like dig deep to be like, okay, well, is Biden worse than Trump? Was Hillary worse than Trump? And I think there's some real tough questions that we have to ask about, what are we willing to do for the sake of the next fight, right? Like, Alicia said last time, we're fighting for terrain. We're fighting for the ability to fight again, right? So I think there's some hard questions, and I think like, yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I think it's really, these are challenging times that we're like struggling with, and I think as the left, unity is super important. Not fighting ourselves and losing sight of the big picture is really important. And we have to, just like go all out. There's no time to waste. There's like fastly approaching, primaries, and I think that's the interesting thing about, the question of the left. We want to have the most progressive, the most left candidate, but if we're not doing anything for the primaries, then we're basically saying we don't care, because the primary is where we're gonna get the most left candidate, right? But I think for so long, so many of us, many of our organizations can't do endorsements or have not endorsed or whatever, or not going out for a candidate. So I think in some ways, it's not too late, but I think it's quickly approaching the time where, hey, it might be too late. So my urge to everybody is like, figure out who your candidate is and go do something for them. And, if they can't keep going, then figure out who the next best choice is. And, at the end of the day, remind ourselves, like, what is the alternative if we are not able to defeat Trump? I just think and I think I really appreciate, Donna, what you've said about, like how hard it was, actually, to, as an abolitionist, to, like, then campaign for somebody to run for DA, to win the DA seat. And I think it's hard, but I think it's, like, an interesting process of what we need to do for ourselves. It's like, okay, there's contradictions. Isn't that what it means to be a leftist? It's like, you're always constantly thinking about contradictions, but I think what it is how do you live in the contradiction and, like, keep moving past it, right? That's the hard part. So anyways, a lot of appreciation for everybody on this panel.
Yes, thanks to everyone for a really important discussion tonight. So the only, I guess the only thing that I would like to add to what other people are saying is that, yes to the urgency of this moment and to throw down hard. And I also want us to not mistake the electoral arena for movement building in total, that it's an important part, it's a really important part, and also to hold on to, hold on to our long-term vision and our hopes for what we want, and the electoral wins are really important, and I really believe they should not be our political horizon. They're not everything that we're fighting for, and to be able to hold on to that with all the messiness and all the challenges.
Great. Well, let's thank all of our presenters.